You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
I want to introduce a tradition here for this podcast and all future podcasts, wherein I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present. Knowing the stories of the Aboriginal people will always be written in this landscape. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. So I hope you've been enjoying the podcast so far, and guess what? This is my 150th podcast over 4 seasons so far. So I've got to say I've really enjoyed making these for all sorts of different reasons. One of which is that it satisfies my intense and unbounding curiosity to research topics that are related to making good men great. What is it that we're really talking about? What does it encompass? How can we do things better? And as I've said before, it's not necessarily all about gender. There's lots of different aspects to this. Patriarchy is an ideology that's embraced a whole range of dogmas that affect us, men, women, and children, on a day-to-day basis. And to a large degree, not for the better, no matter how many people try to spin it as such. Issues like dominance hierarchies, alpha males, alpha females, competition is good, collaboration not so good. Although they never say that, but the implication is that competition supersedes collaboration. And we got stacks of research to show and demonstrate how that is not the case. And then we have the issues about evolutionary psychology and the whole debate about nature versus, society or culture shaping the individual to the point of where it molds our brain rather than simply little chemistry kits in our system that supposedly carry all this information. Yes, I know I sound skeptical, but in this day and age we have to. Because it's not just in the sciences that the issue of patriarchy is problematic, but it's also in the humanities and in philosophy. You will have heard me criticize, neoliberalism for what it is, which is an immoral social engineering project that really has eroded our society in many, many aspects. And so, in this particular episode, what I want to focus on is the impact that patriarchy continues to have on our capacity to think more clearly and encompassing. I was talking to someone today, and they asked me about, essentially, what are the defining values of a new masculinity from my perspective. And I was very clear in that, and this is what the whole project of Making Good Men Great is really about, is to give us a way forward out of this mess that was generated over the millennia called patriarchy. And so what we want are men who are inclusive, who are democratic and respectful of differences, who are distributive, who very clearly are accountable, and they're also collaborative. The capacity to share becomes very, very important in this schema. As we can tell, by the economic statistics, a great number of people are not good sharers. They actually don't play well with others. They try to make others play well with each other as long as they get the benefits. And this is where I go, we've got some real work ahead of us to deal with this effectively. And so today's topic came out of the last topic, which is the whole issue about inequality, which I see as a fundamental cancer in society. It is literally working its way through killing us. It's metastasized in its way right through our system, ranging from the political to the economic to the educational and to the psychological. Because when those things are not working well, guess what? We're not going to be ticking over well psychologically. It stands to reason. If you cage an animal, it will not behave the same way as when it's alive in the wild and able to freely roam its environment. And people often go, well, that's a bit of a stretch of analogies. No, it's not. It isn't. Think about it. We currently are constrained and imprisoned by a political and economic system that really contravenes the individual's capacity to thrive. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about this. So the first thing that I want to point out is that inequality is fundamentally immoral. Okay? Now, there are some people out there who will immediately jump up and down and try to make the point that, well, inequality is neither moral nor immoral. It is something different. It's in the nature of things. Not all things are equal. And we hear this from the men's rights movement, and we hear this from various, neoliberal politicians. We hear it from, people who are staunch fanboys of Jordan Peterson and Ayn Rand and that ilk. And without putting too finer points on it, it's interesting, it's always leaning towards further and further right. And so we have the conservatives who are now becoming ultra-right wing. But let me make this very, very clear. Inequality is immoral because most of it's constructed. It has no place in its natural way of being. I mean, let's talk about, yes, men and women are different in their strength, physical strength. They're not equal. But we are equal socially once we put us outside of the physical realm. And we spend most of our time in a social relationship basis, in a system. Then this is a choice that we make. So let me firstly define a little bit about what I mean by morality, because this often also gets into a whole bunch of stuff where people can get themselves very twisted. So very simply put, morality is a code that guides a person's choices and behaviours throughout their life. Now, this is to be read that it's not purely based on an individualism. It's relational. And the idea of a moral code therefore extends beyond the individual to include what is determined to be right and wrong for a community or a society at large. So some people want to argue that there is no moral imperative in raising children. We have no moral obligation towards a child. There is nothing in that. And I call bullshit on that. Basically, the fact that I, as a parent, or I, as an individual, have chosen to have a child immediately makes this a contractual arrangement on behalf. And if I take the contract out of it, it is simply I have made a decision to bring into the world a being that for at least the next 15 years is dependent on me. And therefore, I have a responsibility and I have an accountability in that regard. So, the first place when we talk about inequalities, we need to check our moral compass. Okay, so what's your moral compass? Do you think it's okay to, take from the rich by stealing from them? Therefore, white collar crime, for example, as a administrator, do I justify me stealing from my employer because they're insured? Or if I take it down to the grassroots level, if I go into a shop and I take something from that shop, well, can I justify that that's okay because the shop's insured? All right. But there are also other moral questions that I need to address that are not quite as obvious as that. And they actually happen fairly frequently. So my moral compass cannot just be about myself. We saw that with the whole COVID thing and the anti-vaxxers, you're stealing my freedoms. Yeah, but what about the freedom not to get sick from your decision not to be vaccinated, or at least not to adhere to social isolation? Right? You see, you can't have one moral compass that clashes with the well-being of others. I take a right to carry a weapon, a highly provocative position in my book. Well, does that give me the right then to provoke someone else to draw their weapon and we can then have a shootout? I think it's, tricky and complicated. So the question of morality becomes very important when we talk about inequality. Now, it's been very evident in my life that since the introduction of the neoliberal ideology in the late 70s, inequality has just exploded exponentially. 1% of the world's population owns half its wealth. And the richest people in the world and companies get increasing amount of gains from economic growth. It does not translate down to the grassroots. Remember, it's a trickle-down economy. Well, there was a cartoon once where it showed a couple of rich people standing on a platform and urinating down onto the masses. Well, that's about the sum of it, folks. That's really what that applies. So, according to these right-wing ideologists, inequality is perfectly natural. Therefore, it's not a question of morality. And that tinkering with it would illicitly interfere with people's freedoms. And I keep thinking about this. Remember what I said earlier on. They argue that inequality is natural, just like patriarchy. Remember that little number. Because people vary with respect to biological features such as height, strength, energy, and intelligence. And since there's no way to level people down to the same abilities, we should respect that some people are going to be more successful in accumulating wealth. Well, again, this whole thing was trotted out in relationship to women for eons, right? But what's the problem with inequality? Well, heaps of them, folks. So for a start, let's get into education. Inequality leads to poor education. If you don't have the resources, you can't tap into the educational system. Now, our politicians have been very, very, very good at making sure that there's a two-tier system. There's the private school system and there's the public school system. And guess who's got the biggest chunk of the educational pie? Because we subsidise private schools. So they're double dipping. So there is a moral issue there. It also leads to poorer physical and mental health, right? If you impoverish people, they're going to be prone to anxiety, depression, addictions, a whole range of psychological disorders. Now, one of the things that we very neatly do is we attribute most of those to the person's disposition. That is, well, that's in their nature. They've got a chemical imbalance in the brain, that they are wrongly wired. some of that might be true, but not in its entirety. So the other problem is that inequality fragments society into little ghettos wherein crime and addiction run rampant. And it's not just between men and women, it's between different groups of people. Dominance hierarchies establish themselves in inequitable environments. So the question arises then: what is it that we need to level out this inequality, this immorality, this cancer that strikes through society? Now, a psychologist called Maslow had a very nice little model, called self-actualization, and it's a hierarchy of what it is that a human being needs to get to self-actualization. I'm not going to get into that in detail because most of you are going to be familiar with it. Those of you who aren't, have a look at it. What I'm going to do for the next few minutes is talk about two psychologists, Richard Ryan and Edward Deci, who in 2017 used stringent criteria for developing and deciding what should count as basic psychological needs. Really important stuff, okay? Because if we will psychologically, the chances are that we're going to be better physically. Remember, men, those of you who are in a loving relationship, marriage, are 7 years more likely to live longer than your mates, okay, who are not. The 7 years added on to your base life span. I didn't put that very eloquently, but let me get back to the role that I was on. So firstly, they decided a candidate factor should be strongly positively associated with psychological integrity, health, and well-being, while its frustration is negatively associated with health and well-being. Second, a need must come with specific experiences and behaviours that lead to human well-being, in contrast to the vague ideas like Maslow's self-actualization. So a little bit of hint about thinking about Maslow. Third, hypothesizing a need should serve to explain or interpret experimental phenomena concerning work and personal attachments. Fourth, psychological needs differ from biological needs in that they are connected with the growth of an individual, not just drives to prevent deficits. Now, this is really, really important. Fifth, needs are causal variables that, when satisfied, lead to positive outcomes, and when thwarted, lead to negative outcomes such as illness. And sixth, basic psychological needs are ones that operate universally across thousands of human cultures. So, what they found in their endeavour was that the existence of three fundamental psychological needs emerged: autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And the big thing that inequality encroaches on well-being is a lack of autonomy. You become chained to the system. You become a slave, essentially. So when we talk about things like the right to bodily autonomy for women, that just doesn't exist. So once that's breached, we cannot, in our culture, in our society, in fact, talk about a democracy when we have 52% of the population who has no bodily autonomy, where that is usurped by the patriarchal system, by the dogmas that exist within the ideology. So, in essence, it is immoral to have societies that interfere with the satisfaction of needs for autonomy, for relatedness, and for competence. So lots of food for thoughts out there. It's not definitive, but it's a little bit more succinct. what I've tried to do with this is to crystallize it more, to demonstrate or begin to demonstrate, to begin to lay down an argument that anything that is not equal is immoral and therefore cannot be used in a democratic system. Until next time, this is me signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at noirtainment.com.